This is the place. You're in the right
Oh,
place.
welcome. Now we can start.
Yeah.
Does it matter where I sit?
Anywhere.
On your bottom would be best.
I reckon. Mind.
Everybody thought that, but you're wrong. That's it.
How long will No, I have an elderly parent.
No, we're going to be over at 8:30. That's the plan. So,
How are you? Just so simple.
okay, welcome everybody. For those of you who are here for the prior series, welcome back. For those of you who are coming for the first time, welcome for the first time. The topic for this series is Judaism and science. Is there a conflict? By a show of hands, how many would assume there is a conflict? Okay, how many would assume there is not? Okay, almost half and half.
And you're here to find out.
You're here to find out. It's a safe answer. Some people ask me the question in response to this question. Who cares? Why does it make a difference? If there is a conflict, there's not a conflict, what difference does it make? If you have faith, it doesn't matter what science says. If you don't have faith, so then you don't have faith. Why does it make a difference if there's really a conflict between Judaism and science? And the truth is, in some religions, the idea of having blind faith is praiseworthy. That's a very high level to achieve. When you think about life, you think about choices that we make in life, or convictions that we have about any topic, religion, politics, or anything else, there's one of three categories that it could fit into. Number one is knowledge. I know this to be true. I know I'm standing in a room right now with many fine people discussing Judaism and science. I know that. Number two is something called belief. Belief, I guess the most simple interpretation of that word is, I don't know for sure, but I have a logical basis to go by. It makes sense. If you tell me that, hey, they're towing your car, and you're somebody that I know, I don't assume you're lying to me. Do I know for sure my car is being towed? No, because I'm not seeing it. Right? The expression is seeing is believing. It's not true. Seeing is knowing. Belief is something else. Belief is, I don't know for sure, but I have good reason to assume something is true. That's level conviction number two. Number three is something called faith. What does faith mean? Faith means it's not a knowledge. It's not something that's based on knowledge. Rather, it's something that's based on absolutely no knowledge, no logic, no reason. But I somehow I have a conviction, I feel strongly about a certain belief for a different reason. Either because my parents told me to believe this, or because I'm in a society, in an environment where everyone else believes this, so I kind of just follow along. But there's no logical basis for believing, for thinking what I do. So some would say faith is a very high level. That shows that you don't care about reason, you don't need any scientific evidence. I'm committed. Not a Jewish idea. We don't like faith. You look at me and you probably think, he's a rabbi, you're probably a man of faith. It's not true. I have very little faith. But it's not because I'm lacking religiosity. It's because my philosophy in life is that faith is a very dangerous thing. I'll explain why. Let's say, for example, a person has faith that there's a creator of the universe who created human beings to do good things, to help people, to give charity, to be kind, and based on that faith, they live their lives. Can much harm come from that perspective? Not really. That's beautiful. That's faith translating into something good and beneficial. But it's that same exact faith It's that same conviction that's based on zero logic that enabled millions of people to participate in what the Nazis did. How is it possible? Do they have any clear knowledge or belief that the Jews were somehow negative and infecting society in a bad way? No. It was based on the rah, and getting emotional and somehow getting swept away with this whole idea. They were able to use their faith to kill and murder innocent people. So faith is therefore a very dangerous thing. Anything that we do in life that's based on zero knowledge, by definition, is going to be dangerous. So number one, the Jewish perspective is it's not really productive, because believing in anything without any rational basis doesn't make sense. Number two is not only is it not productive, but ultimately it can be very dangerous and very harmful. So we don't like faith. What is the one thing we know we have, the one tool that we know we have to make choices in life, to make big decisions, small decisions? The intellect. I might not know many things, and I might believe that there are many things beyond the intellect, and that may be true. But the one thing I know I have is logic. I know that math is true. I know that 2 + 2 = 4. The intellect is something we can rely on. In the Jewish perspective, the intellect is something that's so central, that's so massive to the whole religious philosophy. Many times people associate religion with escaping reality or denying logical facts. You picture the religious man sitting there with a hood over his head, deep in meditation, hiding away from the world. Not the Jewish picture of what it means to be religious. Ever walk into a yeshiva, big place where many people are learning Torah together? Are they sitting there meditating? Are they sitting there cordially, politely discussing a matter of Talmud? They're going at it. You walk in there, it's not a library. They're shouting back and forth, standing up, getting this book from the shelf. What are you talking about? Can you read the words? That's Torah. That's the Jewish perspective on what it means to be religious. It's using the mind. It's cherishing the mind, the human capacity, the ability to be aggressive in thinking, to have a vibrant and energetic mind is something that we view from the Jewish perspective as a main tenet, so to speak, of our philosophy. It's interesting, in the prayers we say 3 times a day, the very first request is, Ata chonantanu, we pray for wisdom. It's an amazing thing. We pray for many different things. We pray for health. We pray for livelihood. We pray that in general God should hear our prayers. But the very first request is, give us wisdom. This is the ultimate goal and desire of a Jew. I just want to understand life on a deeper level. I want to perceive truth in its reality. I don't want to be deluded. Men wear tefillin, and we have one on our arms and one between the head. Tefillin is viewed as something that's very holy, a high level of sanctity. Which one is holier, the one on the arm or the one on the head? The one on the head. Why is that a higher level of kedusha, of sanctity? Because the intellect. We cherish the intellect. This is our one tool that we know we have that guides us and directs us in all of life's decisions. This doesn't mean to say, however, that the Jewish perspective is we're supposed to be cold and analytical and non-emotional. It's quite the contrary. Anybody who knows the experience of Judaism, there's laughing, and there's crying, and there's dancing, and there's music. It's a very emotional. But the goal is, and this is where it's somewhat subtle, the goal is to delve into the emotional, to delve into the spiritual, to reach a level of transcendence, starting off though with a basis of logic. I'll give you an example. Person knows that they have a father. I guess everyone does besides a certain man who existed about 2,000 years ago. Most people, though, have a father. And the guy is now 35 years old. He's never met his father. He has the opportunity through DNA testing to be introduced to his father for the first time. And he gets the results back. Now he knows who his father is. Does he have any relationship with him? Not yet. He hasn't met him yet. But the idea is, once I have the logical basis, once I know, once the evidence is here that indeed you are my father, now I can go and try to start that relationship. Then I can make it more emotional. The same thing is true with dating. And sometimes, you know, you hear the stories of she just fell in love with him, but she was so wrong. He was not for her at all. It's not going to work out. There's no chance it's going to work out. So that's an example of getting overly emotional, getting carried away, but not making sure that it makes sense on paper. The first step is we have to make sure that it makes sense on paper. The same thing is true with religion. Forget religion. Religion is a very dirty word, I'll tell you the truth. I don't believe in religion. But Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, one of the great rabbis of the 1800s, has a very interesting comment. He says, in the Hebrew language, there's no word for religion. It doesn't exist. Why not? He said, very simple. There's no such thing. There's reality, and there's a lack of reality. The goal of every human being is to, to the best of our abilities, try to discern what is real, what is true, and pursue that. Religion is something that's man-made. There's no word for that in the Hebrew language. So therefore, the first step in any pursuit of real meaning in life and real purpose, the first question is I have to make sure it makes sense. Otherwise, I could find myself in who knows where, doing who knows what. However, like we said, the goal is not just the analytical, cold assessment of philosophical ideas. The goal is ultimately spirituality, connection, love. That's the goal. The first step, though, is logic. Now, if we have the logic, but we don't have the love, we don't have the feelings of connection and emotion, it's also not going to be sufficient. You take the dating example, and you have it the reverse way. Somebody says, I've been dating her for so long, we've been friends for years. On paper, it makes so much sense. We like the same things, we share the same interests. It's not clicking. What do you do? So many times I'll instruct people if they've been dating for a while, and it's just not working, and they know she's a great girl, but I know it's not going to happen. What should I say? What should I tell her? So I say it's very simple. You blame it on the clicker. We're just not clicking. You have to have the beauty, you have to have the love, the affection with any relationship. Because even if everything makes sense on paper, if that feeling isn't there, it's not going to work. So the same thing is true when we explore any aspect of life. If I am committed not to believe something, then even if you'll show me logic, reason, evidence, I'm still not going to believe it. I think there's an ancient saying by Simon and Garfunkel. A man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. Very true. If I don't want to hear what you're telling me, you could show me everything and bring the testimony and eyewitness testimony of everybody and the DNA evidence. It doesn't make a difference. I don't believe you. The famous example of this we spoke about at the Bright session. In the 1200s, the Ramban, Nachmanides, was invited. We say invited by the King James of Aragon. It wasn't really an invitation, it was more of a command. He had the Ramban come to the palace and debate Pablo Cristiani, who was a Jew who turned Christian and was very motivated to show that Christianity indeed was the proper religion. And the Ramban couldn't refuse. He said to the king, I'll come on one exception, with one exception, which is you allow me to speak my mind. I can't be there and just be yelled at without having a response. Interestingly enough, King James responded, okay, speak your mind. He did, and he wiped the floor with Pablo Cristiani. It was like having a ninth grade algebra student facing a professor of Harvard in higher mathematics. It wasn't even a competition. After 3 rounds, it was pretty much clearly over. The Ramban was victorious. The response of King James of Aragon was, I've never seen a man defend a wrong cause as well as you have. You can show me everything in the world, but if I don't want to believe it, I'm not going to believe it. So I think the goal for tonight, and as we continue with the next 2 lectures, is we have to try as much as possible to remove our bias. Some of us might have a bias that I want to feel there's a conflict. I don't want to accept the fact that maybe these things could work out, because perhaps that means more obligation, perhaps that means more restriction. And I think some of us have the opposite bias. Some of us really want it to work out well, because I would love to believe. I'm jealous of those people who have that conviction and that devotion to their religious beliefs. I want to believe also. For now, the goal is put aside the bias, whatever it may be. Let's try to explore the facts, the evidence, and we'll go from there. The goal in this series is not to say things definitively. We're not going to go into the Torah text and say, really, when it says that God created light, it was referring to this particular aspect of the Big Bang Theory. And we're not going to say anything definitively as well in the scientific realm. The goal is, are there valid sources, are there valid approaches that makes things that seem to be in conflict not necessarily so? The goal is not to walk out of here knowing all the secrets of the universe, having in 3 hours altogether the knowledge of the origin of man, the age of the universe, and everything else that people have been struggling with for 6,000 years. The goal is to come to the realization that there's not necessarily a conflict. In regards to methodology, how do we approach this struggle? How do we approach this issue? There's 2 ways to approach it. One is in hindsight, and one is the real way. In hindsight means, whoa, based on modern science, we know the age of the universe is much more than 6,000 years old. It's about 15 billion years old. How do we understand that? Well, it's not a problem. Let's go back into Genesis, and we'll reinterpret the verses to fit with modern science. You could be brilliant, you could be creative, and you could try to do that, but it's not authentic. The goal here is not to go back in hindsight with what we know now to go ahead and reinterpret the verses of the Torah. The goal is based on authentic sources, namely the Torah itself, namely the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the commentators who explained these verses before these modern theories came out. If you could show me something that's clearly written before our knowledge of a particular area of modern science, and that seems to fit with modern science, then that's something that's worthwhile exploring. That's the methodology we'll be using. Some say, I don't get the whole question. Why is there a conflict in the first place? Science and Judaism are very different things. Judaism is addressing the question of why. Science is very often just addressing the question of how or what. Why is there any conflict? And the truth is, Albert Einstein himself suggested this. I'll quote you from Einstein. He says, conflict between science and religion is impossible, as science can only decide what there is and not what there should be. Religion, on the other hand, evaluates the thoughts and actions of man. Therefore, all the well-known conflicts between science and religion should be put down to a wrong evaluation of the situation. Einstein was a brilliant man. He was wrong, though. He was dead wrong. Anybody who knows Judaism knows clear well that there's a lot more to Judaism than just the thoughts and actions of man. It's much more than a source of human conduct or human psychology. It's all there as well, but there's a lot of facts that are stated. The Torah speaks about certain physical, scientific facts that took place. So there definitely seems to be conflict. We can't answer the question by saying there is no question because they're addressing 2 separate things. That's just not true. We know, I want to make one point here though. What he was addressing is a potential conflict between religion and science. I'm not here to address religion. Like I said before, I don't believe in religion. I know one thing, I know Judaism. I'm a rabbi. My goal is to explore Judaism and to see if there's a conflict. The answer of saying they're referring to 2 separate things is not sufficient because many times they're not. Many times they seem to be explaining the exact same thing in different ways. in any question of logic, whenever you have a contradiction, there's one of three ways to approach it. You have A, which is in conflict to B, and they seem to be addressing the same thing. So, one option is A is wrong, B is right. The second option is B is right, B is wrong rather, and A is right. The third option is they're both right, and they're not necessarily speaking to the same point. So, in regards to Torah and science, if we find a conflict, one answer may be that Torah is wrong and science is correct. A second answer may be that Torah is correct and science is wrong. A third answer may be both Torah and science are correct, but they're addressing different points. So just keep this in mind. These are the three potential approaches that will be taken. I'd like to start off with a major conflict between science and Judaism. The scientific world, for the last almost 2,000 years, was confident that the universe had no beginning and at the same time will have no end. Aristotle writes this very clearly in many places, that we know, and he wasn't quoting this law, it wasn't invented yet, but the basic idea of the law of conservation of mass and energy, which is what's here doesn't disappear. And what's not here doesn't burst into existence. These things don't happen. And therefore, his conclusion was, as many of the Greek philosophers, it's very simple. The universe as we know it has always been here and will always be here. Very simple. And this was the approach, this was the perspective of the scientific community for thousands of years. To the extent, it's interesting when you read some of the writings of the Jewish philosophers. You read the writings of Rabbi Saadia Gaon in the 900s. You read the writings of Maimonides in the 1100s, and Nachmanides in the 1200s, and Yehuda Halevi, all of the great philosophers of our tradition. They always quote the scientists as although science believes and they feel they have evidence to prove that the universe has always existed, we know that that's not the case. It's the first line in the Torah, which is, Bereshis bara Elokim, as a Shemayim v'Haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. You can't deny the first line is telling you something very clearly, which is, there was a beginning. There was a creation. And Jews, for thousands of years, were looked at as primitive, old-fashioned, believing these religious doctrines, but far from the scientific reality of the situation. This was true up into the 20th century. We have on the board here, do not be overwhelmed by this, I don't want to bring back bad memories of science class. In the year 1913, Vesta Slipher was looking at a group of stars, and he saw they were moving, but they weren't rotating. He came to the realization that they were actually moving away from planet Earth. That's kind of funny. Why are they moving away from planet Earth? Through his investigation, it wasn't just one group of stars. Altogether, he was able to detect 42 galaxies, all moving rapidly away from Earth at about 700,000 miles per hour. Didn't know what to make of that. 1916 comes along Einstein in his first article with probably the most brilliant, earth-shattering theory of all of science. E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass and the speed of light squared, which basically means, in layman's terms, matter that's traveling at the speed of light squared turns into energy. And that was mind-opening. That was a tremendous breakthrough. Through this theory, it was a whole different reality. There wasn't two separate ideas of matter and energy. There wasn't a separate concept of time and space. Everything became one through this theory. Matter and energy are one. Time and space are interrelated. You can't have time without space. You can't have space without time. A major breakthrough, and the scientific world was in awe, basking in the glory of this tremendous finding of Einstein. However, few people picked up on the fact that there were some mistakes. Going through the math carefully, it was clear there were a couple of equations that didn't quite make sense. So most people brushed it off. Okay, but basically, it's brilliant. Let's embrace it. There were a few, though, that felt, no, we have to understand it better. William de Sitter, Danish mathematician in 1917, who was actually very friendly with Einstein. 1922, Alexander Friedman in the Soviet Union, also a major mathematician. They were working on Einstein's theory of relativity, trying to work out some of these issues in the math. They both came up with the same idea independently, which was the only way to answer the questions on his theory, to make the math make sense, was to assume that somehow the entire universe is expanding out. They were totally unaware of Slipher's findings. They had no idea that he found already 42 galaxies shooting away from planet Earth. But based on trying to make sense out of Einstein's theory, they both came up with the same idea, which is that if somehow everything is expanding, why would that be the case? We're not sure, but at least then the math would make sense. They approached Einstein with this idea. Einstein was not happy. I'll quote you a letter that Einstein wrote. In one case, he says, "I have not yet fallen in the hands of priests." He knew in his brilliance that if you were to tell me that everything's expanding, that means by definition there's a starting point. I don't want to hear about starting points. He writes in a different letter to de Sitter himself, "This circumstance," referring to the expanding universe idea, "irritates me. I don't like it." 1925 comes along. Edwin Hubble in California, with the biggest telescope ever, is able to pick up on the fact that every galaxy within 100 million light years, 100 million light years at 6, right, times 10 to the 17th power. How big, how long is 1 light year? Anybody know? About 7 trillion miles. So 100 million light years would therefore be, any mathematicians here? 100 million times 7 trillion? Ari? A very big number. It's a very big number. So he picked up on the fact that every galaxy within this massive space was all shooting outwards, really confirming the suggestion of both de Sitter and Friedman, the idea that Einstein himself said irritates me. So what do you do with that?
Was it all shifting in the same direction? All moving in the same direction?
Everything was moving away from Earth.
Outward.
Outward.
Nothing was moving towards Earth.
Right. It wasn't like some things were going this way, some things were moving this way. Everything's moving outward. Basically, that gives the impression of some form of explosion.
Where Earth was the center of the explosion?
Well, not necessarily the center, but the way it would work theoretically is that if you have the starting point right over here, and everything explodes outwards, if you're over here in the explosion, then everything you're noticing over here is all moving away from you. Nothing's moving closer. It doesn't mean the Earth is the center, but everything you see is moving outwards. That's all part of the explosion.
Really nicely. So like also too, just not sides, but up, down, everywhere.
Right.
So the starting point, no one knows where it is, but it expands endlessly.
So this is the theory that originally de Sitter and Friedman came up with. That was what Slipher was finding with his 42 galaxies expanding. Einstein felt it was irritating. He didn't want to hear it. Ultimately, though, when Edwin Hubble came around, he seemed to prove this idea of an expanding universe. Until this time, there were basically 3 potential ideas of what the universe looked like. We have the static model, which means basically Aristotle was of the opinion, it just is. It always was, it always will be. This is what it is, it's not going anywhere. That's the static model. Number 2, we have the isolating model, which is interesting. It's a similar theory to the expanded universe, but the thought was, at least potentially, it was like a balloon that was getting blown up. Maybe you have this massive explosion, and then based on the gravitational force, the gravitational attraction, all the matter together, at some point in time, will bring everything back to the center and go back to where it was before. every, who knows, 5 to 10 billion years, and just a constant thing, blowing out, getting back in, blowing out, getting back in. Once again, although this theory is very different than the static model, it was very convenient because you would be able to believe that this is a process that's been happening forever. There's no need to have to feel there is a starting point. There's no need to embrace the reality of creation. Creation is a dirty word, I don't want to hear about it. In these two ideas, you didn't have to go there. The open model, though, was the scary one. The open model, which Einstein was irritated by, was the idea that there was some initial explosion and everything's expanding outward, but there's not enough gravitational pull to bring things back. And according to that theory, there's no way for the universe to exist as it does without having a starting point. So those are the three potential theories before some of these discoveries came along. 1965, probably one of the major accomplishments for the whole Big Bang theory. Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson discovered a funny noise. They were working at their telescope and they heard some kind of buzzing, and they first thought it was bird droppings. They cleaned it off well, they tried again, they redid everything, and they came to the realization it wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a telescope, they were picking up on some noise in the universe. What's the significance of that noise? But the people, namely Friedman and de Sitter, who had this idea of an expanding universe, they actually wrote in their initial essays that if you could somehow prove, somehow detect a buzz, a noise, then that would be further proof to the idea of initial explosion. If there was indeed this explosion that started things off, you would be hearing it, not just from any particular place in the universe, but you would hear this sound everywhere. This is what they picked up on, it's known as the 3K hum. And that was massive, because that pretty much was the proof that the static model was 100% wrong. There was an explosion, things were expanding. Robert Jastrow in 1978, interesting the fact that Robert Jastrow himself, well-known physicist, he was the grandson of Marcus Jastrow. Marcus Jastrow wrote the dictionary translating all the Talmudic words that were in the original Aramaic into English. Marcus Jastrow was a tremendous scholar, his grandson as well as a tremendous scholar. He also, based on many other findings between 65 and 78, agreed with everything up until then that things do seem to be expanding, there's no way around it. Besides the 3K hum, they also discovered a very interesting thing in regards to the elements of the universe. Also predicted by Friedman that if indeed there was a massive explosion, which would mean at the very beginning of the universe's creation, there is tremendous heat, then it would have to be about 75% hydrogen, 25% helium, 1 part in a million of all other elements. And lo and behold, they found exactly as prophesied, so to speak, by Friedman. It is 75% hydrogen, 25% helium, another very clear indication that indeed the universe is expanding from this initial explosion. Now this doesn't make sense. Although it's been accepted, 1990 they had a massive meeting, and pretty much every scientist now believes beyond a shadow of a doubt in the Big Bang theory, which means there was a starting point. So we said that means the static model is not acceptable. How about number 2? Right, how about the idea though of the oscillating model? Maybe everything is expanding, but it's all gonna get back together, and perhaps that was going like that forever. They've proven that the amount of hydrogen needed in outer space to create that level of matter that would have the gravitational pull to bring everything back together just isn't there. It doesn't exist. And therefore, both Model 1 and Model 2 were excluded. We're left with Model 3, which is, as we refer to, the Big Bang theory. Robert Jastrow, who we mentioned, wrote an interesting article in the New York Times I'll read you what he writes. He says, "This is an exceedingly strange development, unexpected by all but the theologians. They have always accepted the word of the Bible, namely, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." Similar idea, Professor Paul Dirac, Nobel Prize winner in 1933 at Cambridge University. He wrote, "Progress in the realm of radio astronomy in the last few years has widened perceptibly our knowledge about faraway areas in space. There is no longer any doubt that creation did occur at some point in the past. Today, any scientist can perform the appropriate measurements and get clear-cut results that testify that the universe was created." The law of inertia is objects at rest remain at rest unless acted upon by an external force. So if there was some initial thing, as some refer to as the primordial fireball, and in that somehow had the energy of the entire universe that at some point exploded, how did it explode? Things don't do anything unless acted upon by an external source. We have the law of conservation of mass and energy, which is the total mass and energy in the universe cannot increase or decrease. That was really the premise of Aristotle on some level. Things don't burst into existence. Things don't just disappear. So we're at a crossroads. On one hand, the scientific world has come to the conclusion that there was a creation. There was an initial point where there was no universe, and then there was an explosion, and there was a universe. I'll quote you from Stephen Hawking. He writes as follows, "As many people do not like the idea that time has a beginning, probably because it smacks of divine intervention. However," he says, "the present evidence suggests that the universe will probably expand forever, never come back to itself." This is a good example of a clear conflict between science and religion, or to be more specific, Judaism, that was a conflict for 2,000 years. In the 20th century, that conflict has been resolved. We now know from the scientific standpoint that the universe has not been here forever. There was a point in time where it started, which definitely points to the fact that there was a creation. Stephen Hawking also writes that there's no way to explain the beginning of our universe within the laws of physics, by definition. Because the laws of physics are based on living in a situation of time and space. Physics tell you how things work within our realm of reality. If there was a point in time, which now all scientists are embracing to be true, that we didn't have our reality, so that means something beyond our known reality had to somehow begin the universe. We don't like saying the term supernatural, but that's exactly what it means. Something above nature, something beyond nature, the way that we understand it, had to be the starting point, so to speak, of our reality. Any questions so far? Easy stuff, right? E equals mc squared and relativity.
If you're thinking of it as a model of like a bomb, right? You have to assemble the bomb, right? So if you're thinking of the total amount of matter in the universe and all the galaxies combined, it's a massive amount of matter. All has to be brought together into one ball, right? One gigantic ball that's 1 trillion miles away, right? Or something like that. Well, where does all that matter come from?
It's a good question. It's a wonderful question. Science can't answer that question.
Can I add something?
Sure.
So, Rambam says that ball was the size of a pea.
We're going to get there. We're going to get there. It's around
What?
Say again?
Rambam says that ball that he's talking about was the size of a pea, rather than that's how much pressure was inside. All the matter, the entire universe was compact, the size of a pea.
Who said that?
This is the Ramban. Actually, Jan is getting to our next step.
Sorry.
No, it's okay to steal my thunder. It's all right. It's fine.
Yeah, but is that a human pea or like a god pea? Really huge.
This is actually another conflict that I wanted to address.
Well, that's infinite gravity holding that matter that tightly together.
Oh.
Right?
Basically, the Ramban writes, we mentioned before he was the one who was part of the debate in Spain in the 1200s. So he writes in his commentary to the Torah based on Kabbalistic sources that everything in the universe, everything in all of our reality was condensed into something the size, he refers to it as a mustard seed. Pea, mustard seed, some kind of, it's all the same thing. Now once again, that, at the time that he wrote that, was in conflict with science. Anybody living in the 1200s in the academia world, the people who were scholars and scientists would look at that, they would read that line of the Ramban and think, that's crazy. We know the universe has been here forever. It's one thing if you want to tell me there was some kind of creation, I don't know, but to tell me that there was a creation in a sense where everything that's here started off in something the size of the mustard seed, that's insane. Another good example of a conflict between science and Judaism. But the theory of the Big Bang states that all of the matter in the universe was compressed together in something about yay big. So once again, interesting example of a conflict. The resolution of that conflict is, as we evolve more in the scientific realm, certain things become clear. Another interesting conflict in regards to the same discussion, the Sforno, one of the great Torah commentators, lived in the 1500s. He has a line where he's addressing the first line of the Torah. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And he said, don't think that God was just creating space. God was also creating time. Once again, that doesn't make any sense. Nobody in the secular world, or for that matter in the religious world, no one would ever have said that time was created. Time is a reality unto itself. Maybe you'll tell me that space was created and matter was created, but time is a constant. Time is always here. Another good example of a conflict between Judaism and science. With the theory of relativity, we've come to the realization, through the brilliance of Einstein, that there's no such thing of time without matter. Time and matter are intertwined. If you could have a reality that's void of matter, then by definition, it's void of time. So another interesting example that there's so many things that were in conflict. As we develop, as we get more clarity in the scientific realm, we see that there's no conflict at all. I'd like to give you another example, somewhat of a different subject. To your knowledge, when is the gender of a child determined?
Fertilization.
Fertilization. Conception. 95%, I think more than that, 98% of the time that's true. And therefore, we have in the Talmud something that seems to be in conflict with that truth. The Talmud says an interesting idea, that if one desires to pray for the gender of their child, they may do so up until 40 days after conception. After 40 days, the Talmud says, it's a worthless prayer. The idea of a worthless prayer is as follows. One of the examples of the Talmud is, to make it somewhat more modern, you hear sirens, you hear an ambulance, and it's going someplace, and it's on your block. For you at that point to turn to God and say, please God, don't let it be coming from my house. That's a worthless prayer.
Too late.
It's too late. Whatever is happening is happening.
Yeah.
So that's an example of a prayer that's just inappropriate. Says the Talmud, the same thing is true when it comes to the prayer for the gender of your child. You're allowed to pray for whatever gender you'd like within 40 days from conception. Any time after, though, is worthless. So there's actually a group of people learning this page of the Talmud in the year 1990. And many times in synagogues throughout the world, they have a system called Daf Yomi. It's a beautiful idea, which is that a group of people, and everyone in the world is on the same page, literally, they learn a page of Talmud a day. And many times the person giving the lecture is not the rabbi of the synagogue. He's part of the community. In this case, in a particular synagogue, there was a doctor explaining the page of the day to a group of people, all very well educated, and they came across this passage of Talmud, which is in Tractate Brachos on page 60, and they read this line, that you're allowed to pray for the gender of your child within 40 days. So the person giving the lecture said, listen, sometimes we do find discrepancies between the Talmud and science. It's hard to know how to answer it. The very next day, there was an article in the New York Times with the following discovery. Although mostly the gender of the child is determined at the point of conception, point of fertilization, there are some cases where the gender can be determined up until day 43 through 45 from conception. The person saw the article, who was giving the lecture, came back in the next day with a copy of it in his hands, and he said, you know what, guys? I guess the Talmud was right. Now there's somewhat of a discrepancy. The Talmud's telling us within 40 days, yet science has discovered within 43 to 45 days. How do we understand that? So once you get that close, the answer is probably give science a couple years and they'll somewhat adjust it. But another interesting example of a clear conflict between science and Judaism. Something that until the year 1990, you would have read that passage of the Talmud, you would have had the perspective, okay, whatever, they didn't quite have the grip on things. So many times we see the idea that science can actually be not only congruent with Judaism, it can actually strengthen our commitment to Judaism, because we see some of these ideas that were thought to be random and perhaps even primitive for thousands of years are being shown to be true through the scientific method. The examples we gave tonight were examples of a seemingly a contradiction and resolving the contradiction by showing that indeed science is wrong. Now it's a very dangerous thing to have that attitude in general. To disregard science and say, yeah, what do they know what they're talking about? They're probably just making mistakes. You're just being ignorant. Science, the people who are involved with physics and astronomy, they're very brilliant people. Chemistry professors, these people are brilliant. And we should never disregard what they say. The goal is to understand what the science is and to understand what the Jewish sources are. What I'd like to do next week is as follows. Next week, I'd like to explore a couple of ideas that we know from the world of modern science that seem to be in conflict with what Judaism says to be true. A couple of examples as teasers. Number one is it's true. In regards to the age of the universe, finally the scientific world in the 20th century came to the realization there was a creation. In regards to the idea that time was created, now we understand that as well. In regards to the idea that everything starting off into something the size of the mustard seed, we now understand that as well. Science was wrong in those areas. But we have many areas where science seems to be correct, namely the age of the universe. The universe, according to scientific theory, based, we'll explore next week, but based on very, very solid proof, assumes the universe to be around 15 billion years old. You read the beginning chapter of Genesis, it seems like the whole creation took 6 days. It seems like we alluded to in the history session, we said we're not going to get into the 6 days, but now we will. It seems to be our whole existence has only been 5,773 years. How do we understand that? It's one thing to prove creation, but how do we understand the age of the universe? Question number one. Question number two, which is very similar, is we find fossils. It's not just through looking at space and determining that we've been here a lot longer than 6,000 years. We have fossils in our own Earth that through carbon dating, which is generally speaking very reliable, also seem to prove that people have been here, that animals have been here, that dinosaurs have been here for millions of years. Somebody told me that they asked a question to one of their teachers, how do we believe in dinosaurs? The Torah says that the universe as we know it, reality as we know it, is only about 6,000 years old. But yet we find dinosaur fossils that seem to go back 70 million years. The response this person got was getting this response from a person who was not super learned. But the response was, we don't believe in dinosaurs. So the response to that was, but we found the bones. We have the fossils. Pretty clear evidence there were some massive creatures here 70 million years ago. To that the teacher said, maybe when God created the world, he put the bones in there. The bones were in there when he created the world to test us, to test if we really have the belief, or perhaps in this case the faith, that the universe is only 6,000 years old. I don't think we feel comfortable with that approach. I think the normal response would be when you find bones in the ground, probably came from an animal. And if carbon dating suggests that these bones are more than 65 million years old, that's a conflict. That seems to be something that has to be addressed. Hopefully next week we'll get into that. I'd also like to explore the origin of man. Once again, a similar concept. We'll see there are differences. Did man evolve, as many people assume based on the theory of evolution? Or did man burst into existence based on the creation of God, as the Torah seems to indicate? These are some things we'd like to explore next time. I don't want to keep you here right now any longer. It's been very intense, very dense material, little food for thought. The goal is, though, to explore with an open mind, to remove the bias in either direction, and I think by doing so we'll have a deeper appreciation, hopefully, of both science and at the same time the Torah itself. Have a wonderful evening. Any questions? Okay. Right. The question is, where did that mustard seed come from? If it was always here, so then the question is, based on the law of inertia, how did it change? And there's nothing external to act upon it. What took place? So, not to say this is the proof of the Creator, but it definitely proves the universe was not always here in its present form. I was waiting. See, no, guys, we're not starting until Jan comes, but then he didn't come, so I figured okay. How about that?
Moisha. That was mine. That was my great grandpa.
I've been traveling a little. Represented at this I wasn't here, but I heard a lot of
You gotta know this.
Well, we see you guys every Sunday.
You need the knowledge to know the
Okay, there you go.
Welcome back. How'd you enjoy it?
Well, good. Like astronomy. He's going to continue it.
Yeah, he has like there's 3 parts to the egg.
Is it next week?
Next Tuesday and Tuesday after. Same time. Rabbi, how are you? How much is it? Is it 25? No, because it's 15.
Like this is one of
It doesn't pay for the service.
How you doing, Eric? Good. How are you?
Rabbi, how's your new little girl?
She's good.
Yes? Are you getting any sleep?
I went to what we do at a national conference the last couple of days. I saw her for a second today, but I
So you've had 2 days of normal living?
I just went to dinner at Fair Jungle. They have a treetop, like 1,000 people. But I decided I'll come back, see the family, see the class. She's doing good. It was a C-section, so it took a little longer, but
That's major
we're about a month. Actually, a couple is sitting here, it's their daughter who's delivered. So, they come with their daughter sometimes.
Yes, yes. She's a mill.
Right. I learned her son, the wife.
You told me Federer. Bob's still We'll send her my best. He's going to stay another week after surgery.
He's going to have the surgery, so I was going to update you. I haven't been here.
She gave me a dissertation. We have it on tape.
I got his message.
Oh, yeah, from Beverly. She told me that she was
Oh, I got an email from the daughter.
Depending on the...
She gave me a
Just give me
whole
1 second. I want to see that.
Obviously. So how do we get the backyard? That's it. I need to leave my chair.
Jerry.
It's, you know, this is something. No, that's weird. It's a whole discussion. So there's a middle domain, which is between private and public. Now, this is really just to read a history. Now, when it came to the Big Bang Theory,
Tell me where it is and I'll meet you.
years ago. So you learn.
There's a whole track that you talk about. Then you compare with this. Yeah. So what we say over here is we constructed around 2 miles, which is wide. Is the air that way. And then you've got the school here. Yeah, strings and poles and all kinds of